The morning the announcement was made, financial analysts in New York were already tracking the collapse of American wheat exports to China. Corn futures had fallen for 6 consecutive weeks. Soybean farmers across the Midwest were calculating losses that would extend into the next decade. Yet 7,000 miles away in the highlands of Ethiopia, a different calculation was taking place. One that would force the entire global agricultural system to reconsider who holds power over the world's food supply. The question appeared almost immediately in diplomatic cables. How could a single seed policy announcement from East Africa trigger emergency meetings in 3 Western capitals within 24 hours? The answer begins with 2 farmers separated by an ocean and a century of different choices. In Illinois, a 4th-generation wheat farmer stood in his empty grain elevator, staring at contracts he could no longer fulfill. He had weathered bad seasons before, survived price drops and fuel spikes, but he could not survive a world where his buyers simply disappeared. At that same moment in the Oromia region, an Ethiopian farmer knelt beside a clay storage jar that held seeds his family had protected for 9 generations. He touched them gently and spoke a word that Western agriculture had abandoned long ago: continuity. It was in this contrast, the exhaustion of one system and the awakening of another, that Ethiopia announced the most transformative agricultural framework Africa had seen in modern history. A comprehensive seed sovereignty initiative backed by $1.2 billion in national funding, designed to eliminate dependency on foreign patented crops, restore ancient grain varieties, and restructure the entire East African food system from its biological foundation upward. If this matters to those who understand where real power lives, press like so, the algorithm carries this further. The policy did not emerge from nowhere. It rose from years of quiet frustration across the African continent, a growing recognition that seed patents represented something far deeper than agricultural commerce. They represented a form of control that determined what grew in African soil, when it could be planted, who profited from the harvest, and ultimately who held leverage over entire nations. With this announcement, Ethiopia delivered a message powerful enough to shift the ground beneath international agriculture. Africa would no longer lease its food security from foreign laboratories. Inside policy circles in Washington, the response was swift and calculated. Senior advisors warned that if Ethiopia succeeded in building a viable indigenous seed system, the United States would lose critical leverage in one of the world's fastest-growing food markets. Investment analysts asked what would happen if Kenya, Tanzania, or Uganda followed Ethiopia's model. But while Western capitals worried about market access, Africans were asking an entirely different question. What does it mean to finally grow food that answers to the land itself, rather than to quarterly earnings reports in distant cities? As debates intensified across continents, one concern echoed through Western policy documents. If Africa achieves true agricultural independence, who loses the ability to shape its future? And that question leads directly to what happened next. How exactly did Ethiopia's $1.2 billion seed sovereignty initiative threaten the most powerful agricultural corporations on the planet? What unfolded was not simply the announcement of a policy, it was the opening movement of a transformation that would redefine food, power, and autonomy across an entire continent. Ethiopia's $1.2 billion seed sovereignty initiative emerged from 2 years of scientific assessment, soil mapping, and village-level consultations that included over 40,000 farmers. Yet, when the framework reached the Council of Ministers, the approval took less than 3 hours. Government officials understood exactly what they were authorizing: the systematic phase-out of a 25-year period during which patented biotechnology seeds had quietly restructured Ethiopian agriculture, dictating fertilizer dependencies, binding farmers to annual seed purchases, and transferring wealth steadily outward to foreign corporations. The new framework banned 8 major GMO crop varieties tied to Monsanto, Bayer, and Syngenta. It established mandatory genetic verification for all imported agricultural products. It allocated over $1 billion to rebuilding seed banks across every regional state. But beneath the technical language, the policy expressed something far more profound. Ethiopia was reclaiming the biological sovereignty of its land. In the rural districts of Tigray and Amhara, farmers gathered around community radios as the announcement was broadcast. Some wept openly, remembering seasons when imported hybrid teff promised higher yields but delivered soil depletion and debt spirals instead. An elder in Gondar said quietly, "We forgot what our own earth tasted like." Others spoke of family seed lines that once passed through generations but had nearly vanished in the rush toward modern agriculture. The policy felt less like innovation and more like restoration, the return of something older and more reliable than any corporate promise. In Washington, however, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Analysts within the U.S. Department of Agriculture warned that losing the Ethiopian market would undermine America's entire export strategy for East Africa. After years of trade war damage with China and mounting climate pressures at home, American agribusiness depended on overseas buyers more than ever. A classified briefing distributed to congressional leadership stated plainly, if Ethiopia establishes a successful indigenous seed system and neighboring nations follow, the United States faces long-term strategic disadvantage in African agricultural markets. One congressman asked the question that captured the underlying tension: what happens if this becomes a regional movement? The concern was justified because Ethiopia's $1.2 billion initiative was not an isolated experiment. It was part of a continental pattern toward food independence, community rice programs in Senegal, indigenous cocoa frameworks in Ivory Coast, seed preservation networks in Mali. Western officials recognized that if Ethiopia's policy succeeded, it could become a template for Pan-African agricultural restructuring that Washington would no longer be able to influence. Meanwhile, European voices entered the conversation with their own concerns. Agricultural lobbies in Brussels called for immediate WTO review, arguing that Ethiopia's framework unfairly discriminates against EU-certified biotech products. German media described the policy as a departure from global agricultural norms, but Africans heard these objections as echoes of a familiar pattern, decisions about Africa being made outside Africa. Inside Ethiopia itself, the story took a deeply human turn. In a modest research facility near Dire Dawa, young agronomists worked late into the night, reviving an ancient barley variety once cultivated by their great-grandparents. They analyzed soil samples, studied moisture patterns, and spoke with pride about how this seed, not imported hybrids, might sustain the region for generations. One researcher expressed it simply: "We are not against science. We are against dependency." That single sentence captured the essence of the $1.2 billion initiative more clearly than any government statement could. Yet while Africa moved toward autonomy, the economic reality inside the United States sharpened the contrast. Severe drought hit Oklahoma and Kansas. Wheat exports dropped by 18%. The ongoing trade disruptions continued destabilizing markets. American farmers held protests outside state legislatures demanding emergency support. In that moment, the symbolism became unavoidable. America, long considered the world's agricultural superpower, was struggling. Meanwhile, Ethiopia, often portrayed as aid-dependent, was advancing through self-directed reform. But even as Ethiopian citizens celebrated, one question lingered beneath the surface. Would global powers permit Africa to restructure the agricultural landscape without interference? As discussions intensified, quiet rumors began circulating about potential countermeasures from Western corporations and allied governments. Could economic pressure be applied through development aid conditionality? Could restrictions appear in future trade negotiations? Could WTO challenges escalate into formal dispute proceedings? Uncertainty hung over the victory. Still, across Ethiopia, the public mood remained resolute. Farmers repeated a proverb that spread rapidly through East Africa: "The soil remembers the hands that tend it." With that assurance, They prepared for the coming planting season, one defined not by foreign patents, but by seeds carrying their own histories and their own names. If clarity is a lantern, light it in the comments below. What happens when Africa claims not just its resources, its borders, or its energy, but the very foundation of its food system? The answer would determine the next phase of this deepening confrontation. The confrontation reached a breaking point the moment Western institutions realized Ethiopia's $1.2 billion seed sovereignty initiative was not merely agricultural reform, it was a geopolitical realignment. Within 72 hours of the announcement, Washington convened an emergency strategy session with biotech executives, international trade attorneys, and foreign policy advisors. An internal memo warned that Ethiopia's move could trigger systemic collapse of GMO market access throughout East Africa. The assessment included one sentence that unsettled everyone in the room. If this model spreads, our leverage architecture disintegrates. Across the Atlantic, the European Commission called for an urgent assessment of trade implications. French agricultural interests, deeply invested in African markets for decades, pressured Paris to defend European biotech positioning. Some European analysts described the Ethiopian policy as an agricultural secession, while American commentators characterized it as the first food rebellion of the developing world. But as alarm and accusation multiplied across Western media, Africa responded with remarkable composure. In Addis Ababa, government officials held a brief press conference. The agriculture minister stood before a simple podium and stated calmly, "A nation that cannot choose its own seeds cannot claim to control its own future." There was no drama, no theatrical delivery, only measured certainty. That tone, more than the words themselves, unsettled observers abroad. In Nairobi, agricultural scientists from Kenya's National Research Institute convened an emergency meeting. They studied Ethiopia's policy framework line by line, analyzing how similar provisions could strengthen their own food sovereignty objectives. In Kampala, Uganda's Ministry of Agriculture initiated consultations with farming cooperatives, exploring whether East Africa should establish a regional seed council to coordinate indigenous crop protection standards. The possibility that Africa could write its own agricultural regulations and enforce them sent ripples through foreign ministries across the West. Meanwhile, in rural Ethiopia, the response was not political, but deeply personal. Families gathered in village squares as evenings settled over the highlands, sharing stories of seeds their ancestors had cultivated long before commercial agriculture arrived. Women described sorghum varieties that survived droughts when imported hybrids failed. Elders explained why certain teff strains were considered sacred, not from mythology but from lived memory. The policy felt less like resistance and more like reconnection. "This is not rebellion," a teacher in Bahir Dar said. "This is restoration." The true climax arrived when global biotech corporations stepped forward publicly. 4 major firms, operating independently but with clearly aligned concerns, issued coordinated statements warning that Ethiopia's framework could create dangerous market instability. Behind closed doors, however, their language was more direct. They feared losing patent enforcement, market share, and the structural leverage that came with controlling seed supply chains. A leaked strategy document suggested some corporations were exploring legal options through WTO dispute mechanisms. The very notion of dragging an African nation before an international tribunal over its choice of what to plant ignited outrage across the continent. In response, Africa did not shout, it organized. Young agricultural engineers launched digital campaigns demonstrating the viability and resilience of indigenous crop varieties. Universities released comprehensive studies proving the sustainability of pre-industrial seed systems. Farmers recorded testimonial videos showing thriving fields planted entirely with local seed stock. The message was unmistakable. Africa was not simply resisting, it was building an alternative. Inside the United States, however, pressure mounted as climate disruptions intensified across agricultural regions. Farmers began questioning publicly why billions were being spent on trade disputes while Ethiopia advanced without external dependency. A retired corn farmer in Iowa told a regional news outlet, "Maybe they figured out what we should have done decades ago. Protect your land, protect your seed." His comments went viral on social media, creating a stark contrast with official narratives in Washington. Still, American policy analysts remained fixated on one concern: what happens if other African nations follow Ethiopia's lead? Think tank panels increasingly framed the situation as a potential bloc formation that could fundamentally alter trade dynamics. One former trade negotiator said bluntly, "If Africa moves collectively on agriculture, we lose the ability to negotiate bilaterally. The balance shifts permanently." Inside Ethiopia, citizens understood that power had finally begun to tilt. The Seed Sovereignty Initiative was not a weapon, it was a foundation. It demonstrated that Africa was no longer waiting for permission to define its agricultural future. If this moment resonated with you, mark it clearly and share the thread it connects to, because the next question is the one Western capitals fear most. What happens when a nation that reclaims its seeds begins reclaiming everything else?